The Galactic Council had existed for thousands of years, ruling over countless star systems and maintaining order among the many species that roamed the stars. They had seen countless civilizations rise and fall, and with every new species that emerged, they judged its potential based on intelligence, technology, and military strength. When humanity was discovered, the Council barely paid attention. To them, humans were nothing more than a primitive, reckless species that had just begun venturing beyond their small blue planet. The more advanced civilizations observed them with amusement, noting their wars, their unpredictable nature, and their strange ability to survive against impossible odds. But none of that mattered to the Council. Humanity was weak, technologically behind, and unworthy of serious consideration. So when the Exalthar Dominion, a brutal and expansionist empire, declared war on humanity, the Council chose to stay silent. They believed it would be a short, one-sided war, just another insignificant event in the grand history of the galaxy. When the war began, the Exalthar launched a devastating attack on human colonies, wiping out settlements with terrifying efficiency. Their warships, equipped with energy weapons and shields far superior to anything humans had, tore through human defenses as if they were nothing. Entire planets fell in days, and the Dominion's commanders laughed at how easy it was. Humanity, they believed, would crumble like every other lesser species before them. They had conquered countless worlds, subjugated hundreds of races, and no one had ever resisted for long. The Council received reports of the battles, but didn't even bother to discuss them. There was no point in interfering when the outcome was already certain. But the Council had made a mistake. They had underestimated humanity. The first sign that something was wrong came when Exalthar fleet invaded a relatively small human colony on the edge of their territory. The invasion was supposed to be quick, a mere formality. The Dominion's ground troops landed, expecting to find frightened civilians and weak resistance. Instead, they found something entirely different. The humans fought like no species the Exalthar had ever encountered. They didn't fight to delay or to surrender later, they fought to kill. With weapons inferior to Exalthar technology, they set up ambushes, used unconventional tactics, and turned the planet's terrain against their invaders. When they ran out of ammunition, they used explosives. When those were gone, they fought with blades and their bare hands. The Exalthar war machine had crushed countless civilizations before, but now, for the first time in history, they found themselves trapped, unable to advance. The battle that was meant to last hours stretched into weeks. A single human colony held off an entire fleet. As news spread, the Galactic Council began to take notice, though they still considered it nothing more than an anomaly. One colony resisting didn't mean humanity stood a chance. But then it happened again. And again. The Exalthar continued their assault, but each time they moved forward, humanity adapted. Unlike other species, humans learned at an astonishing rate. Every battle they lost taught them something new. Their strategies changed unpredictably, their soldiers grew more resilient, and their scientists worked tirelessly to improve their technology. Human engineers captured Exalthar weapons, studied them, and found ways to counter them. What was supposed to be an easy war became a nightmare. The Dominion, once certain of victory, now found itself facing an enemy that refused to break. The Galactic Council, now concerned, sent envoys to the Exalthar leadership, advising them to negotiate peace before the war dragged on any further. The Exalthar refused. Their pride would not allow them to accept that a primitive species was outsmarting them. So they gathered their greatest fleet, the largest armada they had ever assembled, and sent it straight to Earth. It was meant to be the final strike, the death blow that would erase humanity from history. The Council watched with curiosity, wondering if this would finally be the end. But the humans had been preparing. The Battle of Earth became a legend. The Exalthar fleet, confident in its overwhelming power, launched its assault, expecting a quick victory. But humanity had learned their enemy well. They knew their tactics, they knew their weaknesses, and most of all, they knew how to turn the tide of battle. Human warships, though smaller and technologically inferior, fought like no fleet the galaxy had ever seen. They used unpredictable maneuvers, sacrificed ships, and brilliant strategic traps, and exploited weaknesses the Excelthor didn't even know they had. On the ground, human soldiers defended their planet with a ferocity that terrified even the most hardened Excelthor warriors. The battle raged for days, and for the first time in history, the mighty Dominion's fleet was utterly annihilated. The Galactic Council was in shock. No species had ever done this before. The Excelthor Dominion, one of the galaxy's most powerful empires, had been brought to its knees by a species they had all dismissed as insignificant. In a final desperate act, the remaining Excelthor leaders sent a plea to the Council, begging for assistance. But the Council did nothing. They had made a mistake once by ignoring humanity. They would not make another by standing against them. The Dominion collapsed within weeks. Planets they had conquered for centuries revolted, emboldened by humanity's defiance. The once mighty empire crumbled, and humanity stood victorious. Now the galaxy watched in uneasy silence. The species they had ignored, the civilization they had dismissed, had risen as a new superpower. The Council, for the first time in its long history, had to recognize humanity as an equal. But they also feared what came next. If humanity had achieved this level of dominance in mere decades, what would they become in centuries? No one knew the answer. But one thing was certain: humanity would never be underestimated again. The first attack came without warning. The Excelthor Dominion, an empire that had conquered and crushed civilizations for thousands of years, did not believe in diplomacy. They saw humanity as nothing more than another weak species to be eliminated. They had studied human history, watched their wars, and laughed at their primitive technology. They saw humans fighting among themselves, wasting their resources on internal conflicts, and assumed they were incapable of standing against a true interstellar force. The Galactic Council, made up of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, did not interfere when the Dominion prepared for war. They believed, like the Excelthor, that humanity was doomed the moment the first warship entered their space. And so, the attack began. The first wave of Excelthor warships entered human territory undetected. They moved in complete silence, hidden from human sensors using advanced cloaking technology. Their strategy was simple: strike fast, destroy everything, and leave no survivors. The first target was a colony called Nova Prime, a thriving settlement on the edge of human space. The people there were civilians, scientists, and farmers, completely unaware that death was approaching. Without warning, the Excelthor fleet descended, unleashing destruction. Buildings crumbled under the force of their orbital bombardment. Entire districts were turned to ash in seconds. The skies, once bright with twin suns, turned black with smoke. The Excelthor did not give warnings, nor did they offer surrender. They came to destroy, and within hours, Nova Prime was gone. News of the massacre spread quickly, but instead of fear, it ignited something else: rage. Humanity had always fought among itself, but when faced with an external threat, they united like no other species in the galaxy. The leaders of Earth and the outer colonies gathered, their voices filled with anger, demanding action. The Galactic Council, still believing that humanity had no chance, advised surrender. But humanity had no intention of surrendering. They had seen what surrender meant. The Excelthor did not take prisoners. They did not negotiate. There was no choice but to fight. The Dominion, expecting a quick and easy war, moved deeper into human space, striking another colony, Artemis IV. But this time, they faced something unexpected. When their warships arrived, the colony was not defenseless. In just a few days, humanity had mobilized its forces. They did not have the advanced technology of the Excelthor, but what they lacked in power, they made up for in adaptability and strategy. The Excelthor attacked from orbit, but human forces had already prepared underground bunkers and reinforced shelters. Instead of waiting to die, the people of Artemis IV turned the planet into a battlefield. When the Excelthor ground forces landed, expecting an easy victory, they found themselves trapped. Every street, every ruined building, every crater was a trap. Humans did not fight like other species. They did not stand in formation, waiting to. For the first time, the Dominion suffered losses. Their commanders, furious and confused, ordered orbital strikes to clear the resistance, but it was too late. Humanity had already figured out their weaknesses. Human pilots, flying outdated but heavily modified starfighters, launched daring attacks on the Excelthor warships. They flew recklessly, using unpredictable movements that confused the enemy's targeting systems. They did not retreat even when outnumbered. Instead, they used suicide tactics, crashing damaged ships into Excelthor capital vessels, crippling their fleet. The Dominion had fought hundreds of wars, but they had never faced an enemy like this, an enemy that refused to surrender, refused to run, and fought with a level of desperation that defied logic. The battle for Artemis IV lasted longer than any Excelthor commander had predicted. The Dominion had planned to wipe out the colony in hours, yet days passed, and they were still struggling. Human forces used the terrain to their advantage, fighting in ruined cities, tunnels, and dense forests, striking from the shadows and disappearing before the enemy could respond. The Excelthor, who had never experienced prolonged resistance, began to falter. Their soldiers, used to swift victories, started to hesitate. Their fleet, damaged and losing ships, retreated for the first time in their history. The unthinkable had happened, the Dominion had lost a battle. The news spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The Galactic Council, which had been indifferent to the war, now watched with concern. How could a young species like humanity stand against the might of the Dominion? How had they adapted so quickly? And more importantly, what would happen if they won? The Excelthor, humiliated by their defeat, did not retreat for long. Instead, they launched an even larger invasion, determined to wipe out humanity before the war escalated. They gathered their largest fleet, thousands of warships, and sent them straight toward the heart of human space. They would not make the same mistakes again. This time, they would burn everything. But humanity was no longer fighting to survive. They were fighting to win. In just weeks, human scientists had studied captured Excelthor technology, learning its weaknesses. Engineers worked day and night, modifying human weapons to penetrate enemy shields. Military strategists analyzed every battle, predicting Excelthor movements with terrifying accuracy. The Dominion had expected a weak, disorganized enemy. Instead, they found an opponent that adapted after every fight, turning every loss into a lesson. When the Excelthor fleet arrived for their final attack, they found not a broken species, but a unified force, ready for war. The battle that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Excelthor, expecting an easy slaughter, were met with overwhelming resistance. Human warships, though smaller, fought with a level of strategy the Dominion had never encountered. They lured enemy ships into ambushes, used electronic warfare to disrupt communications, and even turned disabled vessels into massive bombs. On the ground, human soldiers fought with relentless determination. Even when wounded, even when outnumbered, they refused to stop. The Excelthor, who had never known fear, now tasted it for the first time. By the end of the battle, the impossible had happened. The Dominion's greatest fleet was shattered. Thousands of Excelthor ships were destroyed, their ground forces wiped out. The survivors fled in terror, their belief in their own superiority broken. The war was far from over, but the tide had turned. Humanity had proven they were not prey. They were not weak. They were not afraid. They were something else entirely, something the Excelthor had never expected. As the remnants of the Excelthor fleet retreated, the Galactic Council finally understood the truth. Humanity was not just another species to be conquered. They were warriors, survivors. And now, with their blood boiling and their rage ignited, they were coming for revenge. The galaxy had seen many wars, but none like this. The conflict between humanity and the Excelthor Dominion had started as a one-sided slaughter, with the Dominion crushing human colonies with merciless efficiency. The Galactic Council had watched in silence, expecting the war to end within weeks. After all, humanity was young, inexperienced, and lacking the advanced technology that older civilizations had perfected over millennia. But the war did not end. It evolved. And what the Council and the Dominion had failed to understand was that humanity was unlike any species they had ever encountered. They did not simply fight to survive, they adapted, they learned, and when pushed to the edge of extinction, they did something no one expected. They fought back harder than anyone believed possible. The turning point came when the Dominion launched its largest assault yet. Over 1,000 warships, carrying millions of soldiers, descended upon Epsilon Prime, one of the last major human strongholds. The planet was heavily fortified, but against the overwhelming firepower of the Excelthar, even the strongest defenses were expected to crumble within days. The Dominion's strategy was the same as always: strike fast, hit hard, and leave nothing behind. Their ships rained down destruction from orbit, turning cities into molten wastelands. Their ground forces deployed in massive numbers, advancing with terrifying precision. The first few hours of the invasion seemed to confirm what everyone feared: humanity was on the brink of collapse. But then, something changed. The Excelthar commanders, confident in their victory, had made one fatal mistake: they underestimated human desperation. They had studied human warfare, but they had not understood the depth of human resilience. As their forces pushed deeper into the ruined cities, they found themselves trapped in a battlefield they did not expect. The humans had prepared for this moment. Their soldiers did not fight like any other species. They did not stand in neat formations, they did not retreat in fear when outnumbered, and they did not hesitate even when faced with certain death. Instead, they used the wreckage of their own cities as weapons, setting up ambushes in the ruins, turning every street into a death trap. Excelthar soldiers, used to fighting predictable battles, suddenly found themselves attacked from every angle. Hidden explosives collapsed buildings on top of entire battalions. Snipers struck from the shadows, picking off commanders with terrifying precision. Underground tunnels allowed human forces to appear and disappear at will, striking at weak points before vanishing like ghosts. For the first time in their history, the Excelthar suffered catastrophic losses. Their forces, designed for overwhelming brute force, were unable to adapt to the chaotic, ruthless tactics of the humans. Their soldiers, conditioned to expect quick victories, began to hesitate. Their commanders, seeing their carefully planned invasion spiral out of control, grew desperate. They ordered full-scale orbital bombardments, hoping to wipe out the resistance by reducing the planet to ashes. But humanity had already predicted this move. Before the war had even begun, they had prepared for the worst-case scenario. Underground bunkers shielded their forces, hidden energy fields absorbed the worst of the bombardments, and advanced hacking teams disrupted enemy targeting systems, causing Excelthar warships to fire on their own troops. The humans had turned their own weaknesses into strengths, and for the first time, the Dominion realized they were facing something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The battle for Epsilon Prime lasted weeks instead of days. The Excelthar, once confident in their superiority, now found themselves in a brutal war of attrition. Their losses mounted with every hour. Their warships, once untouchable in space, were being hunted by human pilots flying outdated but highly modified starfighters. The Excelthar Navy had always relied on automated systems, assuming they were superior to living pilots. But human pilots did not follow predictable patterns. They fought recklessly, using insane maneuvers that no AI could anticipate. They pushed their ships beyond their limits, using their very destruction as weapons. They did not fear death the way the Excelthar did. Every fallen pilot, every lost ship, only fueled their comrades' rage. And then, the true turning point came. Humanity, after months of studying captured Excelthar technology, had discovered something their enemies had never expected. The Dominion's strength did not come from their own technological advancements. It came from stolen knowledge. The Excelthar had built their empire not by innovation, but by conquest, taking the technology of every civilization they had destroyed. And that meant they had weaknesses. The humans, unlike any other species, did not simply copy enemy technology. They improved it. They weaponized it in ways the Excelthar had never imagined. And when the next wave of Dominion warships arrived, they were met with something the galaxy had never seen before: humanity's own version of their technology, modified to be even deadlier. The first human-made energy weapons cut through Excelthar shields like paper. Human stealth ships, using modified cloaking technology, struck deep behind enemy lines, disabling their command ships before they could even react. New hacking viruses infiltrated Excelthar AI systems, turning their own war machines against them. entire fleets were disabled in seconds. The Exalthar commanders, once so sure of their dominance, now faced an enemy that had outsmarted them at every turn. The final blow came when humanity launched its first counteroffensive. Using their newly developed weapons, they struck deep into Exalthar-controlled space. For the first time in history, Dominion worlds were under attack. The Exalthar, who had never known fear, now faced something far worse, the realization that they were losing. Their once unshakable empire was crumbling. Their fleets were being torn apart. Their soldiers were surrendering, something that had never happened before. And worst of all, they now understood the truth: humanity was not just another species to be conquered. They were something entirely different. They were a force that refused to be broken. The Galactic Council, watching in stunned silence, now faced an even greater fear. They had let the Dominions start this war, believing humanity would be destroyed. But now, they saw what humanity was capable of when pushed to the edge. They were not weak, not predictable, not controllable. They were something far more dangerous. They had survived extermination, adapted, and now they were winning. The Council realized too late that they had made a mistake. Humanity was no longer the hunted. They were becoming the hunters. And as the last Exalthar warships fled in disgrace, the message was clear: this war was far from over. But the balance had shifted forever. The Exalthar Dominion, once the most feared power in the galaxy, was no longer unstoppable. The true war was only beginning. And for the first time, the galaxy understood what it truly meant to face humanity in battle. The Exalthar Dominion had ruled the galaxy for centuries, their power unquestioned, their dominance unchallenged. They had conquered countless civilizations, absorbing their technology and erasing their histories, leaving only ruins and fear in their wake. To the Galactic Council, they were the ultimate force, an empire that could never be stopped. But history had a cruel way of punishing arrogance. The fall of the Exalthar Dominion did not come from a mighty alliance of ancient civilizations, nor from an internal collapse of power. It came from humanity, a species they had dismissed as primitive, weak, and unworthy of notice. And by the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. The war had started as an invasion, Exalthar warships descending upon human colonies, expecting another easy victory. They had seen it all before: pleas for mercy, desperate resistance, and then inevitable surrender. But humans did not surrender. They fought back with a kind of determination the Dominion had never encountered. They did not simply resist, they adapted, evolved, and retaliated. The Dominion's greatest strength had always been its ability to overwhelm enemies with superior numbers and advanced weapons, but against humans, it was a strategy that began to fail. Humans did not fight like the other species the Dominion had crushed. They did not accept defeat even when faced with impossible odds. They refused to break a T first. The Dominion believed it was just a delay, a small obstacle in an otherwise predictable war. But then the battles began to change. Human forces, once scattered and disorganized, started striking with terrifying precision. They had studied their enemy, learned their weaknesses, and turned the war into a game of unpredictability. Exalthar warships, which had never known fear, now hesitated before entering battle. Their supply lines were sabotaged, their communication networks infiltrated, and their ground forces slaughtered in battles they should have won. The Dominion's greatest minds tried to understand how this was happening, but there was only one answer: humanity had become stronger than anyone had ever imagined. The true turning point came when the humans did something no other species had ever dared. They did not just fight defensively. They took the war to the Dominion's own territory. In a bold and reckless move, human forces launched an all-out counteroffensive, striking deep into Exalthar space. The Dominion, which had always been the attacker, suddenly found itself on the defensive. Their outer colonies, once thought to be untouchable, were now burning. Their proud fleets, which had terrorized the galaxy, were now being hunted, outmaneuvered, and destroyed. The Exalthar had always relied on sheer numbers, but now they faced an enemy that fought differently, and refused to play by their rules. What made it worse was that humans did not just use their own technology. They had taken Exalthar technology and improved it, making it deadlier, more efficient, and unpredictable. They had hacked enemy AI systems, turned captured weapons against their creators, and developed new tactics that the Dominion had no answer for. The Excelthar, once so confident in their superiority, were now desperate, fighting a war they no longer understood. The final blow came when Earth's forces reached the Dominion's capital world. No one had ever dared to attack the heart of the Excelthar Empire. It was protected by the most advanced defenses in the galaxy, surrounded by fleets larger than entire civilizations. But it did not matter. Humanity had already proven that nothing was impossible. They had spent years studying the Dominion, understanding how they fought, how they ruled, and most importantly, how they could be broken. The attack was swift, brutal, and unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Instead of a traditional invasion, humans launched a precise, coordinated strike, targeting key infrastructure, leadership compounds, and military installations all at once. The Excelthar government, believing their homeworld was impenetrable, had never prepared for the possibility of invasion. They had spent centuries attacking others, but had never defended themselves. And so, when the first human warships breached the capital's defenses, there was no backup plan, no emergency strategy, only chaos and fear. Excelthar generals ordered a last stand, believing they could still salvage their power. They sent every remaining warship, every last soldier, every ounce of their military strength into one final battle. But they were already beaten. Humanity had anticipated their every move, cutting off their reinforcements, jamming their communications, and forcing them into battles they could not win. The once mighty Excelthar Dominion, which had ruled the galaxy through terror, now found itself trapped in its own nightmare. Their fleets were annihilated. Their leadership collapsed. Their people, once brainwashed into believing in their empire's invincibility, now saw the truth: the Dominion was falling, and there was no way to stop it. When the last Excelthar warship was destroyed, when the final stronghold was taken, when the ruling council was finally captured, the message was clear: the Excelthar Dominion was no more. The species that had ruled through fear, through blood, and through conquest had fallen to the one force they had never accounted for: humanity's unbreakable will. The galaxy watched in stunned silence. The Galactic Council, which had once feared the Dominion's power, now feared something else: humanity's rise. They had expected the Excelthar to remain the dominant force, but now they saw something far more dangerous. Humans had not just survived, they had won. And in doing so, they had proven that no empire, no matter how powerful, was beyond defeat. And so, as the ashes of the Dominion settled, a new era began. The Excelthar were no longer the superpower of the galaxy. Their fleets were gone, their cities occupied, their people left with nothing but the ruins of an empire they once believed would last forever. And humanity, the species they had underestimated, now stood at the center of galactic history. They had not just fought a war, they had changed the future. But as the last battles ended, one question remained: what would humanity do next? The war was over, but the galaxy would never be the same. The Excelthar had fallen, but something far more powerful had risen in their place. And the other civilizations of the galaxy now had to face a new reality: humanity was not just another species. They were something far more dangerous, far more unpredictable, and far more unstoppable. The era of the Excelthar Dominion had ended. The era of humanity had begun. The war was over. The once mighty Excelthar Dominion, which had ruled the galaxy for centuries, lay in ruins. Their fleets were shattered, their leaders either dead or in captivity, and their homeworld now under human control. What was once the greatest empire in the known universe was now nothing more than a collection of broken worlds, struggling to accept the reality of their defeat. But while the galaxy watched in stunned silence, wondering what would happen next, humanity was already moving forward. The war had changed them, not just their soldiers, but their entire civilization. They had fought, adapted, and emerged victorious against an enemy that had once seemed invincible. And now, as the dust settled, a new question arose: what would humanity do with its newfound power? The Galactic Council, a coalition of ancient civilizations that had long feared the Excelthar, had expected humanity to collapse under the pressure of war. They had believed the humans would resist for a time, suffer great losses, and eventually surrender like all the others who had stood against the Dominion. But instead, humanity had done the impossible. They had fought back and won. And now, the same council that had once ignored Earth was sending envoys, diplomats, and desperate pleas for alliances, all hoping to understand this rising force before it was too late. But humanity did not trust the council. They had seen how these so-called peacekeepers had done nothing to stop the Dominion's tyranny. They had stood by, watching entire civilizations be wiped out, refusing to act unless their own interests were threatened. And now that the balance of power had shifted, they came forward with offers of friendship. Humanity was not so easily deceived. They understood now that the galaxy respected only one thing's strength. While politicians debated what role humanity should play in this new galactic order, the military was already preparing. They knew that the war with the Excelthor had been only the beginning. Humanity had proven itself, but that also meant they had drawn the attention of other civilizations that saw them as either a threat to be eliminated or an ally to be controlled. Neither option was acceptable. Humanity would not bow to another power, nor would they be manipulated into serving another empire's interests. They had fought too hard to allow their future to be dictated by outsiders. If the galaxy feared humanity's strength, then so be it. They would not hide it. The first step in securing their dominance was consolidation. The former Excelthor territories, now under human occupation, were filled with species that had once lived in fear of their former rulers. Some celebrated their liberation, eager to join humanity's new order, while others resented the change, fearful that one conqueror had simply been replaced by another. But humans did not rule through terror like the Excelthor had. They rebuilt what the Dominion had destroyed, restoring planets that had been stripped of their resources, freeing species that had been enslaved for generations, and offering protection to those who had none. It was not mercy, it was strategy. If humanity was to rise as the next great power, they needed loyalty, not just submission. And so, while their fleets remained on high alert, their diplomats worked tirelessly, forging new alliances, securing trade routes, and ensuring that humanity was seen not just as warriors, but as leaders. But not everyone welcomed this change. There were those who still viewed humans as nothing more than a primitive species that had gotten lucky, a civilization that had won a war but could not possibly sustain its dominance. Whispers of rebellion grew in the shadows, former Excelthor generals plotting their revenge, waiting for the moment to strike. They believed that if they could deliver a decisive blow, humanity would crumble. And so, in the darkness of space, they gathered what remained of their forces, preparing for one last desperate attempt to reclaim their fallen empire. Their attack came without warning. A fleet of warships, remnants of the once mighty Excelthor navy, struck deep into human-occupied space, targeting supply lines, communications hubs, and key military outposts. It was a brutal, relentless assault. But if the Excelthor had learned anything from the war, it should have been that humans never broke under pressure. Instead of retreating, instead of panicking, humanity responded with terrifying efficiency. Within hours, entire squadrons were mobilized, striking back with a level of coordination that the Excelthor had not expected. Their desperate offensive, meant to be the beginning of a new resistance, became a massacre. Their warships, already weakened from previous battles, were hunted down and destroyed one by one. Their generals, believing they could outmaneuver humanity, found themselves outmatched, outgunned, and outsmarted. In a single decisive battle, the last remnants of the Excelthor Dominion were wiped from existence. The species that had once ruled the galaxy was now nothing more than a cautionary tale, a warning to those who still doubted humanity's place among the stars. And with their final enemy defeated, humanity stood undisputed as the new dominant power in the galaxy. But with victory came a new challenge. Power, once gained, had to be maintained. The Galactic Council, now fully aware of humanity's strength, began working behind the scenes, trying to limit their expansion, to contain them before they became unstoppable. Treaties were proposed, agreements that would limit human military presence, force them into diplomatic ties that would weaken their influence. But humanity was not so easily manipulated. They had fought too hard to give up their position now. They had learned the truth about the galaxy. It was a game of power, and they had no intention of playing by the old rules. If the Council sought to control them, they would find themselves facing an enemy unlike any other. And so, as the era of the Excelthor faded into history, a new age began. The balance of power had shifted, and the galaxy knew that it would never return to the way it had been before. Where once the Excelthor Dominion had ruled through fear, now humanity stood as the force that could not be ignored. Their fleets patrolled the stars, their influence spreading across newly reclaimed worlds, their power undeniable. But what came next? Would humanity continue to expand, forging an empire greater than any before it? Or would they face new enemies, new challenges that would test them in ways they had never imagined? One thing was certain: the galaxy had changed forever. The age of the Excelthor was over. The age of humanity had begun.